It began with silence, an unnatural silence heavy enough to smother an entire valley. And then, a single crack split the night. The echo of gunfire ricocheted through the hills of Michoacán, chasing away sleep and dragging families from their beds. Engines roared in the darkness, headlights slicing through the black as convoys of armed men rolled into town. The sound was a mechanical growl that made every window tremble. Suddenly, the first vehicle erupted into flames. Its fuel tank ignited, sending fireballs skyward and lighting the road in a violent orange glow. Automatic rifles chattered in rapid bursts. Muzzle flashes lit up the adobe walls of village homes. The bullets tore into plaster, wood, and flesh with no discrimination. Inside one home, a mother pressed her children against the floor, her hand covering their mouths to silence their whimpers. The only prayer she knew slipped through trembling lips. The streets became a battlefield. Civilians ran blindly, tripping over fallen neighbors, while gunmen in body armor advanced with chilling precision. On the highway, cars riddled with bullets were abandoned mid-escape. Doors hung open, windshields shattered, blood staining cracked asphalt. The convoys spread outward, sealing exits with burning barricades. Whole towns were trapped, surrounded, cut off from escape or help. Children hid beneath beds. Elders barricaded doors with furniture. Dogs howled until they, too, fell silent. The gunfire rolled like thunder across the valley. For hours, the night belonged to the cartels. By dawn, smoke rose in black pillars over Michoacán. Entire blocks were reduced to ash. The silence that returned was no peace, it was the quiet of death. Scattered across fields and streets lay the evidence of a night drenched in blood, bodies, weapons, abandoned shoes, torn clothing fluttering in the breeze. The survivors whispered of hundreds dead. Others swore it was over 1,000. Some names would never be written, their remains lost in mass graves carved hastily into the earth. The government stayed silent for hours. When soldiers finally arrived, the killers were already gone, their shadows fading into the mountains. What remained was fear, a fear so deep it hollowed out entire communities. And a single question haunted every survivor. How did Michoacán, this land of mountains and valleys, of orchards and quiet villages, become the stage for one of the bloodiest cartel massacres in Mexico's history? The flames of Michoacán still burn in memory. A night when death came in waves, swift, merciless, and absolute. Yet this story didn't begin in that single night of slaughter. No, the massacre was the final scream of a war that had been building for years. To understand how an entire state could be consumed by violence, you must step back, into the mountains, the valleys, and the hidden roads where the cartels carved out their kingdom. Michoacán. Known once for its orchards, avocados, and quiet villages. A land blessed by nature, yet cursed by blood. For decades, its fields have grown not only crops but armies. The people here live between two worlds, the beauty of their land, and the shadow of men who rule it with guns, fear, and fire. The seeds of Michoacán's nightmare were planted long before the massacre. They grew in whispers of cartel alliances, betrayals, and blood debts that demanded payment. At first, the violence came in flashes, disappearances, burned trucks, families mourning in silence. But with each year, the bloodshed grew bolder, more public, impossible to ignore. By the time the massacre erupted, Michoacán had already become a chessboard, its towns and highways pawns in a war between titans, the Knights Templar, La Familia Michoacana, and the rising power of the Jalisco New Generation cartel. The people could feel it coming. Whispers in the market. Shadows on the roads. The sense that something was moving closer, something too large to escape. The massacre was not a single night of madness. It was the eruption of a volcano that had been rumbling beneath Michoacán for years. And so, to understand the massacre, we must trace the roots of the war. Step by step. Blood by blood. Until the night the valley was drowned in fire. The massacre in Michoacán is more than just history, it is a warning, carved in blood and silence. A story too heavy to be forgotten, too dangerous to be ignored. But stories like this only stay alive if they are told. And that's where you come in. If this story gripped you, if you believe it deserves to be remembered, then let your voice be heard. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss the untold truths that others refuse to speak. Leave a comment, share your thoughts, your questions, your voice, because silence is how tragedies are erased. Every engagement, every share, every subscription helps keep these stories alive. It ensures that what happened in Michoacan is not buried in silence. Together, we can shine light into the shadows. This is only the beginning. The story of Michoacan's bloodshed begins not with one massacre, but with the slow erosion of peace. For decades, organized crime seeped into the state like poison into water, first in whispers, then in storms. La Familia Michoacana was among the first to seize the land. They wrapped themselves in the disguise of protectors, preaching moral codes, quoting scripture, punishing thieves. But beneath the sermons lay iron fists. Their justice was swift, brutal, and always final. By the mid-2000s, they controlled highways, ports, and villages. Farmers paid them to move their harvests. Politicians bowed, or vanished. Whole towns became chapters in the cartel's Bible of fear. But power rarely lasts in silence. From within La Familia, a darker faction rose, the Knights Templar. They dressed their cruelty in ritual. They called themselves guardians of Michoacan. Yet their sword cut deeper than anything La Familia had wielded. The Knights Templar terrorized with theater. They hanged bodies from bridges, carved warnings into flesh, left messages nailed to doors. It was no longer crime, it was spectacle. As the Templarios spread their terror, the Jalisco New Generation cartel was rising to the west. Unlike the ritualistic Templars, CJNG was pure firepower, disciplined, ruthless, and armed to the teeth. Their leader, Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, better known as El Mencho, had set his eyes on Michoacan. El Mencho's men stormed into towns with convoys of armored trucks. They carried rocket launchers, heavy rifles, and endless ammunition. To civilians, they seemed less like men and more like an invading army. The battles between cartels were wars in miniature, streets became trenches, villages became fortresses. Each clash left behind more bodies, more widows, more orphans. And yet, for the people of Michoacan, there was no escape. Choosing a side was suicide. Refusing to choose was suicide. Neutrality was just another word for target. Even the avocado trade, the pride of Michoacan, became a battlefield. Orchards were taxed, shipments hijacked, farmers kidnapped. The fruit of the land became the fuel of the war. In some towns, citizens tried to fight back. They called themselves autodefenses, self-defense groups. Farmers with hunting rifles and machetes, teachers with pistols, priests blessing weapons before battle. For a time, they drove the cartels out. But power is a disease. Some autodefenses became indistinguishable from the very cartels they had sworn to destroy. Lines blurred until no one knew who was truly protecting them anymore. And all the while, the state itself faltered. Corruption seeped into police ranks. Politicians made pacts in the dark. Files disappeared, evidence burned, trials abandoned. Justice was a ghost that never set foot in Michoacan. The stage was set. Years of betrayal, spectacle, and silent complicity carved a scar so deep it could only end in an explosion. Everyone could feel it, the night was coming when the valley would drown in blood. That night would claim 1,200 souls. But to understand how the massacre unfolded, we must first trace the final sparks that set the powder keg ablaze. The war for Michoacan didn't erupt overnight. It spread like fire across dry brush, first sparks, then embers, then roaring infernos. Skirmishes that once ended in a handful of deaths grew into battles that left entire towns paralyzed. Convoys rolled through highways at all hours. By day, farmers carted avocados to markets. By night, armored trucks carried gunmen through the same roads, their engines snarling like beasts. Villages became staging grounds. Cartel commanders demanded loyalty, food, and silence. Anyone who resisted was made into a warning, displayed where all could see. Rivalries deepened. The Knights Templar clung to their rituals, hanging banners over roads, promising divine judgment. CJNG answered not with words but with firepower, ambushes, convoys, heavy weapons no Mexican state had seen before. Battles spread from remote hills into towns. Streets once filled with children became corridors of gunfire. The sound of laughter was drowned by the rattle of rifles. Each clash left behind not only bodies, but silence. Survivors stopped talking. They no longer dared to describe what they had seen. Terror lived not just in the violence, but in the quiet that followed it. The autodefenses, those citizen militias, rose again, stronger, more organized, driven by desperation. But their lines blurred. Some fought to protect their villages. Others took money, weapons, and orders from cartels themselves. In certain towns, entire police forces vanished overnight, some out of fear, others because they had joined one side. For civilians, law no longer existed. Only power did. Rumors spread faster than truth. Whispers of an impending attack traveled from village to village. Families buried their valuables, stocked food, prepared hiding places. They knew something was coming, they just didn't know when. Then came the convoys of intimidation. Dozens of vehicles rolling slowly through villages, not firing a shot, just letting their presence linger like smoke. The message was clear: we are here. And soon, we will return. The government's response was weak, fragmented. Soldiers arrived days late, patrolled empty streets, then left. Their absence became an invitation. The cartels filled the vacuum with ruthless precision. Soon, towns were no longer battlegrounds, they were prizes. Whoever held them controlled the highways, the orchards, the ports. Whoever lost them was erased. Gunmen began wearing military uniforms. At night, no one could tell the difference between a soldier and a sicario. Trust eroded until everyone was suspect. The clashes grew louder, more destructive. Not firefights, but sieges. Not murders, but massacres. Each month bled into the next. Each town feared it would be the next to fall. And then, the whispers coalesced into one truth. It was no longer a question of if. The massacre was coming. And Michoacan was the stage upon which it would be written in fire and blood. It began before dawn. The valley was still wrapped in darkness, broken only by the occasional bark of a stray dog or the faint hum of cicadas. For a brief moment, Michoacan seemed calm, too calm. But those awake felt it in their bones, something was about to happen. The first sound was not a gunshot, but engines. Dozens of them. A growl that started in the distance and swelled until it became a roar that shook the ground. Convoys of trucks and SUVs, headlights off, moved like shadows down the dirt roads. Then came the signal, an explosion that ripped through the silence. A blockade was set ablaze, cutting off the highway. Flames shot into the sky, marking the beginning of the slaughter. Within minutes, gunfire erupted. Heavy weapons, not small arms. The staccato rhythm of assault rifles mixed with the deafening thuds of grenades. It wasn't a clash, it was a full military assault. Villagers woke to chaos. Doors burst open, families fled barefoot into the fields. Mothers clutched children to their chests. Fathers shouted names into the smoke, searching for loved ones already gone. On the highway, cars filled with fleeing civilians were riddled with bullets. Some crashed into ditches, others burned where they stopped. Escape was impossible. On the highway, cars filled with fleeing civilians were riddled with bullets. Some crashed into ditches, others burned where they stopped. Escape was impossible. The cartels closed in from every side. Blockades sealed exits. Gunmen swept into villages, house by house. Anyone suspected of helping the rival was dragged into the street. No mercy was shown. Witnesses later described the sound, not the gunfire, not the explosions, but the screams. Screams that seemed to carry through the valley, carried by the wind, echoing from village to village. Entire streets were transformed into execution grounds. gunmen shouted commands, dragging their enemies into lines, cutting them down in bursts of automatic fire. Even those who tried to hide were not spared. Homes were set alight. Trapped families had to choose between smoke and bullets. As dawn crept over the horizon, the scale of the carnage became visible. Dozens of bodies lay strewn across highways, fields, and village streets. And still, the gunfire had not stopped. By mid-morning, the massacre had swallowed entire communities. Schoolyards became graveyards. Churches filled not with worship, but with the dying. The numbers grew too high to count. Witnesses swore that convoys of bodies were taken away, buried in secret pits, erased from official records. Survivors whispered the toll was in the thousands. When the army finally arrived, the killers were gone. Their tracks vanished into the hills, leaving only silence. But silence was worse than the noise. Silence meant the dead would never speak, and the living would never forget. The massacre of Michoacán ended not with gunfire, but with emptiness. Streets once alive with music and markets became graveyards of memory. 1,200 dead, or more, yet no one held accountable. Only fear remained. When the gunfire stopped, Michoacán was no longer the same. The air carried not the smell of earth and harvest, but smoke, blood, and silence. Survivors emerged from hiding, eyes wide, hands trembling, their faces blank with shock. They stepped carefully, as if the ground itself might break under them. Bodies lay in the streets, scattered as if frozen mid-flight. Dogs circled quietly, sniffing at the remains. There was no crying at first. Just silence, as though grief itself had been stunned. The first cries came from a schoolhouse. Mothers pulled their children from hiding places, classrooms blackened by fire, chalkboards still marked with unfinished lessons. For many, their children did not answer. Churches, once sanctuaries, had become morgues. Priests struggled to offer prayers as their chapels filled with bodies. Candles burned low, melting onto the blood-stained floors. Faith clung on, but only barely. By noon, news of the massacre began to ripple outward. Families in neighboring towns rushed to find loved ones, only to be met with walls of silence, or with shallow graves already being dug. The army's arrival brought no comfort. Soldiers walked streets stiffly, stepping over the dead, their expressions unreadable. They spoke little. Some villagers whispered that the soldiers had known but chose not to intervene. Officials promised investigations. They spoke of justice, of restoring peace. But survivors noticed what wasn't said. No mention of the number of dead. No acknowledgement of how the killers moved so freely. Unofficial counts spread in whispers, hundreds gone. Then whispers turned to thousands. Survivors said entire hamlets were erased from the map. And yet the official reports mentioned only a conflict, with no numbers confirmed. Forensic teams arrived days later, their white suits glowing under the sun. But even as they uncovered shallow graves, survivors muttered that many more had been hidden deeper, far from the eyes of investigators. Families searched hospitals, morgues, and police stations. They clutched faded photographs, pleading with anyone who would listen. Many never found answers. The missing simply vanished into the earth. In the villages that remained, silence reigned. Markets stood empty. Fields went untended. Nights were sleepless, haunted by the memory of engines in the distance. Survival now meant not speaking, not asking, not remembering aloud. Children carried the heaviest scars. Some drew pictures of trucks and fire instead of flowers. Others refused to speak at all. A generation marked before it could grow. And still, whispers of complicity hung in the air. Who allowed this to happen? How could convoys roll through checkpoints unnoticed? The answers never came. The silence was its own confession. For Michoacán, life after the massacre was not life as before. It was an open wound. Every sound of an engine at night stirred panic. Every stranger passing through was met with suspicion. Survival became a daily calculation. The massacre did not end with the dead. It lingered in the living. In their silence, their fears, their unanswered questions. 1,200 gone, or more, and no justice to this day. Which left only one question: if this could happen once, what would stop it from happening again? History has many wounds. But some do not heal, they are simply covered, silenced, and left to fester beneath the surface. The massacre in Michoacán is one of those wounds. A story too large to measure, too painful to tell, and too dangerous to ask about. Officially, little was said. Numbers blurred, reports redacted, names erased. But survivors kept count in their own way, not on paper, not in reports, but in memory. Each missing face was a tally mark etched into their souls. Some whisper that the massacre was not simply violence, but a message. A demonstration of power by those who rule outside the law. A warning that Michoacán was not governed from the capital, but from the shadows. And if that is true, then the question becomes unavoidable: who allowed this message to be written in blood? Who stood by while entire villages disappeared into the fire? To this day, not one trial has delivered justice. Not one leader has taken responsibility. In Michoacán, truth itself feels outlawed. Those who ask too loudly risk becoming part of the silence themselves. But memory is stubborn. Stories leak through cracks. Survivors remember the engines, the gunfire, the screams. Mothers still call their children's names at night. The earth still holds the bones that officials refuse to count. In the years since, Michoacán has lived under a fragile peace, one built not on safety, but on silence. A peace enforced by fear, where the price of speaking is higher than the price of forgetting. And yet the question remains, echoing like the gunshots that once tore through these valleys: how did Michoacán become the stage for one of the bloodiest massacres in Mexico's history? Perhaps it was the clash of cartels, each more ruthless than the last. Perhaps it was corruption, those in power looking away. Perhaps it was something darker, a message, meant for all of Mexico to hear. But here lies the truth that chills the most: no matter the cause, the dead remain. Their stories unspoken, their voices silenced, their justice denied. And so the silence itself becomes the loudest testimony. Michoacán is not just a place on a map. It is a graveyard of unanswered questions. And until those questions are faced, the massacre will never truly end. It will live on, in whispers, in shadows, in the silence after midnight. The survivors know this. They live it every day. When they plant crops, they remember where they buried the dead. When they walk through the plaza, they see ghosts in the windows. For them, the massacre is not history, it is the present. And for those who watch from the outside, the question remains: if this could happen in Michoacán, could it happen elsewhere? Could it happen again? Perhaps that is why this story was buried. Not because it was forgotten, but because it was too terrifying to face. Too heavy to admit. Too close to the truth about who really holds power. 1,200 lives. An entire region in fear. And silence from those sworn to protect. This is the legacy of the Michoacán massacre. And until the truth is spoken, the silence itself is the only voice that remains. If stories like this grip you, and you want to uncover more of the real events they try to bury, make sure you subscribe. There are more untold truths waiting to be heard.